watches and clocks, and is very active in many different professional societies. He runs a business having to do with repairing and selling and appraising clocks. And he will be talking about some of the old clocks some of you brought in today. And I'm sure we're going to have a great time. There'll be time later for refreshments and probably a chance to ask questions informally. I'm sure he'll have a formal question and answer period also. So without any more, Mr. Frishman.
Thank you. Did you have something to ask? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out to hear me tonight on a nice evening. I drove down from Andover earlier, and we're staying with some friends, Ron and Loretta Price, who live in Westport. So thanks to them too for giving us a place to sleep afterwards. That was good. I could have slept here, I guess, but I'm sure their spare bedroom's going to be more comfortable. So what you're looking at here is not the talk that you're getting, that you're going to get. It shows my horology and art project, which for some years now I've been collecting images of fine art which have clocks and watches in them. And I did a number of articles about that for our Clock Collector magazine. And the culmination really last year was I ran a symposium, a conference on this at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where I had international speakers who spoke about art from 700 years ago and even earlier up until the present that had timepieces in it. So that's a whole nother lecture, but I like starting it off with some eye candy so you can see, not that one, but other, my wife always says, take that one out, yeah, but and I always forget and then I see it. So I apologize if anyone didn't like that one, but there won't be any more like that, I'm sure. But anyway, that's another lecture that I can do at other times, or if anyone wants to come out to the parking lot later, I can do it. But you'd have to squint at my iPad, though. But today we're going to talk more about what Bob said we're here for. So let's get that. It even says Dartmouth Talk, so there's hope there, right? That this is actually what we're going to see. So that's good. Because I've been, since 1980 when I met somebody, I've been interested in clocks and watches. And some people just get into it because they want to tinker with old machines. But I always was just as interested in the history and the culture of all this than I was in those old machines, even though I loved taking them apart and eventually being able to put them back together and even, get paid for it eventually. So that was nice. But, I studied political science and history. I worked in politics for a long time. So the historical part of it has always been just about as important as anything else. And trust me, it's much easier to show pictures and talk about it than it is to fix these old things. So, so the more I can talk and the less I have to be bent over my bench looking at a 200-year-old machine that probably should have been thrown out 180 years ago. That's a nice thing for me to do on a pleasant Sunday night too. So you might have noticed my business name is Bell Time, the Bell Time Clocks. And when I first started my full-time business in the 1990s, early 1990s, I just purchased this Winslow Homer engraving of mill workers outside of a textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And at the time I lived in Lawrence, next to Andover where I grew up and where I live now. So there's no clock in this image, but there's a clock tower at the Atlantic Mill building, which isn't there anymore. But you probably know that Winslow Homer started out as an illustrator and engraver. He didn't become a fine artist until a little bit later in his life. And he had a reason to be in Lawrence because he had a brother who was a supervisor in one of the mill buildings. So it was a perfect confluence of me getting this print, starting my business, seeing that the name of this was Bell Time. That's the name of this image that was in Harper's Weekly. So Bell Time Clocks became my business name. Occasionally people think it's Bell Tone and they want me to sell them a hearing aid, but I tell them that's beyond my area of expertise. Although there is one joke, I guess I should tell it since everybody likes to hear a joke at the beginning of a talk, where these two older gents were meeting up, and one said, "Oh, I just got this great hearing aid. It's unbelievable. I can hear everything perfectly." And his friend says, wow, that's great. What kind is it? And he said, 8:15. So I guess that's kind of time related. So anyway, let's move along. You may recognize this as the Mayflower, and I show this picture because it raises the question of how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower. And the answer is 0. Because at that time there weren't clocks that worked on ships. Most people did not own a personal clock or watch, and certainly the people that came on the Mayflower, you see them here embarking in Holland actually to begin their voyage to the New World. You don't see any grandfather clocks being hauled on board here. Again, they weren't able to have affordable or accurate timepieces, so no clocks and watches came with the Pilgrims. They were able to determine intervals of time, like with the sand glass, and those were used on board ship. Usually on shipboard they were half an hour. Some of you may have a Chelsea clock at home that does ship's bells, or maybe served in the Navy where the ship's bells are. So there was that half-hour watch period that progressed over 4 hours in eight half-hour watches. If you were the guy steering the ship, you were also involved with turning this thing over every half hour. And if it was cold out and raining and dark, sometimes you turned it over before all the sand was gone. And this was a phenomenon called eating sand. And if you did it long enough, you'd actually reverse night and day on the timekeeping of the ship. So it wasn't always a good idea, and they would usually catch the guys eventually that were turning the sand glass over too soon. There were clocks in England at this time and other European places, but often they were in big towers like this in churches or public buildings. So that really evolves from the 13th century when there was mechanical timekeeping, and they originally were public clocks. This is the cathedral at Salisbury, where there's one of the world's oldest, perhaps the world's oldest mechanical clock that's still known, from the 1300s. And this is big. This is like the size of a Volkswagen bus almost, if I'm not dating myself. But all iron too, and not particularly accurate. And this one isn't run anymore. There's one that's more accurate up in the church tower. But they were big iron things made by blacksmiths usually. There weren't professional clockmakers then at all. And the idea is that mechanical timekeeping probably originated in northern Italy, where there were monastic orders that were more and more interested in praying at certain specific times, day and night. And they had other methods, sand glasses they turned over, candles with lines that burned down, but it still meant some poor monk had to be up all night staring at the sand glass or the candle and then ringing the bell to wake the monks up during the night. So if they could have an automatic machine that would tell time, that would be an improvement, and again, they think that's where that originated. The word clock derives from the Latin and then Romance languages for bell, and original clocks had no hands at all. They just rang bells at certain times. But of course, there are still clocks in towers. This is the only Monet I could find with a clock in it for my horology and art project. But this is when he was in London and he did paint the tower there. We call it Big Ben, but Big Ben is actually the bell in the tower. So if you want to, win the trivia prize sometime, you can correct somebody that calls that whole clock and tower Big Ben, because it really is only the bell that officially has that name. But certainly if we go back to the 1500s, the 1600s, clocks, domestic clocks, start to appear as the property of rich people. This is the Duchess of Urbino. This is a painting by Titian, very famous Renaissance painter. And these were portraits, and you can see there isn't very much in this portrait, and nothing is there by accident. This isn't somebody snapping a shot with their iPhone. This is a painter deciding with the sitter what they want to wear, what they want to look like, what's in the background and what's in the room with them. So the fact that the Duchess of Urbino selected not only her little faithful spaniel, but and a view of her lands, but a small little, probably German Augsburg or Nuremberg clock to show that she was sophisticated, affluent, disciplined. Clocks immediately were seen as metaphors for all those characteristics and the descriptions for people, they also were indicators of mortality. We're reminding us as we look at paintings that people are only here for a short time. So this is a picture of a clock very similar to what we saw with the Duchess. Again, probably southern Germany. You see there's only one hand because clocks at that time only had one hand. And if you think about it, if you broke the hour hand off, the minute hand off your clock, you'd still know basically what time it was. If the hour hand's in between 7 and 8, you're roughly at 7:30. So you really didn't need that minute hand, and the clocks weren't accurate enough anyway at this point. The accuracy came later, so if you were accurate within a half an hour day, you were doing well. But these were such new novelty things that ran by themselves and made little dinging noises and ticked and told you the time. You know, they were quite appealing again to the people that could afford them. And even early in the 1600s, perhaps even earlier, there were portable timepieces like this watch, also German probably. And again, you see it's one hand. But what you also see is in the lid of this watch is a sundial, because that's the way we knew how to set our watches. Again, there was no, radio, GPS, nobody telling you what time it is unless you had a way of determining it some other way. And nature, luckily, put the sun up there. That's pretty darn regular. It goes around pretty irregularly. So if you have a sundial, you can then set your clock. And that's how we set our clocks up until about 100 years ago. There's still sundials around. This is an example of a sundial that's in the garden at Beauport, which is up in Gloucester, an historic home up there. And you can see the shadow is shining at the time. So as long as it's daytime and not cloudy, the sundial works pretty well for doing that. And if it's in a garden, you come out with your pocket watch and you can set your time based on that. But sundials go way back. This is actually a mosaic that was uncovered at Pompeii, and it's showing, again, from the Greco-Roman time, and it's showing a sundial up on top of a pillar. And by God, the Greek inscription there says, "I'm late for lunch." So even back then, and there are other examples of this, people were already fretting about how these darn timekeepers, before you ate when you were hungry, you went to bed when you were sleepy. Now this thing is telling us when we got to eat, when we got to sleep, when we got to work. So that isn't a modern phenomenon of being ruled by our timepieces. So some other guys had sundials too. This is Roger Williams arriving in Rhode Island after he got kicked out of the Bay Colony. And we still have Roger Williams' sundial, his portable sundial. So this is it. And again, he had no pocket watch, no iPhone in his pocket. So he could pull this out, and if it's, if he's at approximately the latitude that the sundial was made for, he'd know roughly what time it was. The problem with the sun is that it doesn't run regularly like a clock. There's sun time, and then there's clock time. So if you're using your sundial to tell the time, you need an equation of time, which was often inside of watches or inside clock doors, which tells you up to 15 minutes slow or fast on every single day of the year what the conversion is. So if you rush home and check your sundial and it doesn't agree with your watch, one of them is not broken. You just need the equation of time chart to tell you the difference. So sundials too were metaphors. They were used just like clocks to tell us about human values and mortality and all. This is the first American coin. It's called the Fugio cent, and you see "mind your business" there. That's not mind your own business. That's not telling you not to be nosy. That's telling you to be industrious and work hard. And the sundial was a metaphor for that. When the sun's shining, you better get out there and chop the wood or, feed the horses or whatever you need to do to stay busy and productive here in this new land where we all needed to work to make this place go. So it's being used there in its metaphorical sense. And that's related to Ben Franklin, too, with his aphorisms about that. There are other kinds of clocks, too, which might be a little tricky, but this is a floral clock, meaning this is a chart showing you what time the flowers opened during the day. So if you planted all of these, and that's a little, again, tricky because they don't all grow in the same zone, But you would roughly be able to walk out and say, oh, you know, this flower's blooming now, it must be 3 o'clock. So go ahead, plant the garden and see how it works, but it's a fun little concept to do too. So I'm showing this fellow that you may recognize as Galileo because he was instrumental in making clocks much more accurate, because very late in life he was sitting inside the cathedral in Pisa, and I can prove it's Pisa by that other crooked building there, which hasn't fallen over yet, but he was sitting in there, and there was a lantern swinging from the ceiling of the cathedral. And he probably was bored with the sermon. Anyway, he was watching the lantern, and he was timing its swing back and forth with his pulse, which, you know, if you're just sitting there, is pretty good timekeeper. And he noticed that no matter how wide the swing of the lantern was, it went back and forth at the same rate. So he said, you know, I bet this could be applied to clocks and watches, because there was no pendulum before that on clocks and watches. There was something out that clunked back and forth and was not accurate at all. So he, then this is the inside where he was sitting. You know, maybe he just, you know, he'd seen all those beautiful paintings enough, and he was watching that lantern swing back and forth. So even though he never built it, he was already going blind at the time, but he described it to his son, who wrote it in his notes, and eventually this is kind of what it would have, his concept would have looked like. So this was in the early 1600s, but later in the century, Christian Huygens, a Dutch scientist, followed up on this and realized that this would be a way to make clocks much more accurate, and he contracted with the local clockmaker to make a clock movement that had a pendulum. And and this is a drawing of his original clock movement. If you see on the bottom right, there's sort of a front view with a pendulum. And they went from being accurate to 15 minutes, 30 minutes a day, to down to 15, 30 seconds a day. It was a 100-fold improvement in accuracy. Very quickly, all the clocks either got converted to pendulums or it started being made with pendulums. So it was a revolutionary change which allowed a lot of other accurate timekeeping things to spring from it. And there's even a satellite now called the Huygens that's, of course, named after him because his invention really was so important to all kinds of sciences that relied on accurate timekeeping, including astronomy. So in New England, certainly in England first, we saw the Salisbury Cathedral, but eventually in New England, any town that reached a certain size and level of affluence wanted to have a church and wanted to have a tower and wanted to have a clock in that tower. So it became, as in Europe, a way for towns to show that they had reached a certain level of sophistication and affluence. So the community would get together and put their money together and have a clock put in the tower. This is a view of Boston, the old State House, the old brick church, I mean, in Boston. And you can see there's a clock up there. And this is from the 1600s, so not long after the Pilgrims arrived here. Clockmakers came. People wanted to be able to tell time, so if they wanted to meet up to exchange codfish or start a revolution, they all got there at the same time. So clocks were important early on. So if you take a look at this building, you'll see that it's also in this picture on the left there, because this is the Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre, which was one of the beginning events of our American Revolution. This was a propaganda poster. It really didn't happen like this. John Adams defended the British soldiers who were kind of wrongfully accused of blasting away at the rabble. So not only are the facts a little inaccurate here from Paul Revere, but in the first printing of this, he got the time wrong on the clock by 2 hours. So he had to rush out a second printing, which showed on the clock there on the old brick church, showed the correct time that this event took place. So there's Paul Revere, that iconic portrait of him that's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, holding his teapot. So, and there still are plenty of towers in Boston and many other places too that still have clocks in them. Public clocks were very important before everybody could afford their own watch or clock. It was a way, again, of having you know the time. But it got to be problematic because if your city started to have a lot of these and they were trying to set it by the sundial or you know, the deacon climbing the stairs to set the clock, they didn't agree that well. So you could actually have a half-hour, 45-minute period when clocks around the city were gonging 12 o'clock. So if you were going to meet, you know, Ezekiel at noon, you had to say, we're meeting at noon by the State House clock, so that, you know, he didn't get there early because he listened to St. Paul's bell ringing instead and showed up early. So this is the kind of machine that sits inside of those towers. They're big clock mechanisms. I don't work in them. I don't like things that are that big. I don't like what comes out of the other end of pigeons, which is what you find in a lot of these church towers. So I leave that to others. But this is a great example. This is actually, if you see the name on there, this is a tall clock, turret clock mechanism made by George Stevens in Boston in 1852. And some of these machines are still running in towers. There are guys like me who want to work on these things, who go up in those towers and wind them faithfully and service them and make them work. So they're still out there. So here is in North Andover. This is the North Parish Church in the town adjacent to where I live in Andover. And I have this picture because inside there is a bell, and you may recognize the name on the bell, because Paul Revere also was a bell caster. He and his son were in business. So, and there are a couple of hundred, they think, Paul Revere bells around New England that were made by him and are still hanging up in those churches. And in case you didn't believe me, this is one of the ads for Paul Revere and Son, and it's showing the kinds of things that he does, including casting bells. And there's a painting of him later in life. He's not holding a teapot this time. I think he was past that at that point, and he was doing quite well in the businesses that he had. And in fact, his bell casting business was in Canton, so not very far from here. So he wasn't in Boston anymore, but he was quite prosperous at that point. Of course, it would have been a different story if we'd lost the Revolution. He would never have reached this age, I imagine. But around Boston, there were many other towers with clocks in them. Again, we hope that they all said close to the right time, mostly in train stations, because there's a lot of connection, as you'll hear, between timekeeping and railroads. These are buildings that are no longer here. So there's another. But this one is still there. This is the jail in Boston. And you can now stay there not as a guest of the government, but as a guest of the hotel chain that now runs this. It's the Liberty Hotel, so you can stay in the jail in Boston. And as you see, there's a clock up on top there, which I guess wasn't visible by the inmates, but by the people who maybe were visiting them at the time. There were clocks, again, domestic clocks made in New England too. This is an 18th century Japan case clock by Gawain Brown from probably the 1750s. This was on display at the Museum of Fine Arts. So again, rich people could afford tall clocks. Often they were imported from England. And it's a Japan case not because the case was made in Asia, but because everywhere in the Western world we were becoming aware of Asian decorative motifs. So, and they began to be copied in London and then by Japanners in Boston and other American cities as well, who would decorate furniture, including clock cases, with Asian motifs. And up in the top of those grandfather clock dials, sometimes you're probably most familiar with moon dials that go around that's showing you the phases of the moon, but other stuff was up there too, including this one where every hour that poor sheep gets banged on the head by the number of times that the bell is rung. So, you know, what sick person made this, I don't know, but and it's not a clock I own, but it was in a museum exhibit, and I couldn't resist taking a picture of it. So more often there are, you know, nice friendly images up top if there's not a moon dial or a rocking ship perhaps. So this is just an example of one particularly nice dial up in there. And these were white painted dials that originated in Birmingham, England around the 1780s. Because before that there were those brass dials, harder to read when it was dark, much more expensive to make. So in Birmingham, they developed kind of a mass production system of making these inexpensive, relatively inexpensive, hand-painted, beautifully decorated clock dials that soon were on all of the tall clocks of the period. A few times I've said grandfather clock, but again, here's another, sticky thing for trivia buffs, because until this song became popular in 1876, no one called them grandfather clocks. They were called tall clocks or 8-day clocks or long case clocks. But if you went back to Paul Revere and said, let me look at your grandfather clock, he'd have no idea what you were talking about. So, but this song became very popular, so did the poem by Longfellow about the clock on the stairs. So eventually it wasn't grandfather's clock, it was grandfather clock, and that's why we call them that now. And sometimes they were used for other purposes too. So not only were we telling the time, but I guess Dad could stash his stash inside the case. And you find all kinds of great stuff inside clock cases. Occasionally, a friend of mine bought a tall case clock at an auction, and it felt kind of heavy, but he didn't look in the bottom till he got home, and there was a handgun and boxes of ammunition in the bottom. So that was a different story, and I've never found anything that heavy or perhaps interesting or not, but luckily he wasn't stopped by the Mass State Police on his way home, because we might be feeding him now, as they say. But the song was so popular, and so was the concept, but there were even spin-offs. So this was Grandmother's Clock, again, a jaunty kind of tune, but it traveled over. And, people now think that if they have a shorter or smaller grandfather clock, it's actually a grandmother clock. But all these terms are kind of amorphous and don't really mean anything. Small clocks are more accurately called dwarf clocks. So we have a great heritage of clockmaking in New England. This is the Willard House Clock Museum, because a very famous clockmaking family in New England was called the Willards. This is now a museum full of Willard clocks, which you can go and visit. It's in Grafton, Mass, near Worcester. Great day trip if you want to head up there and see some things. So this is Simon Willard. He was one of a few sons who got in the clockmaking business and ended up designing and making very important New England clocks beginning in the late 1700s. So not only did he make clocks, but he was a horologist, which is the science of timekeeping, and he made this escapement model, which is just to show people what makes a clock tick. And this actual Simon Willard made escapement model is at the collection of the scientific instruments at Harvard University. And they didn't even know it was by Willard, but they had another clockmaker sort of clean it up. And then there was Simon Willard's signature on the pendulum. So that was a great discovery by them. This is a colleague of mine, Doug North, who also works in this business. So what the Willards perhaps in part are known for are their grandfather long case clocks in the Roxbury style, because Roxbury was the area of Boston where a lot of the craftsmen lived that were making furniture and clocks. So this is a Roxbury style Simon Willard case that you're looking at there. And I'm not going to talk a lot about how clocks work and why they break and everything, but just so you realize that you shouldn't be mad if you run your clock for 30 years and it stops working. What did I do wrong, or what kind of piece of junk is this? If you look in the bottom half, grandfather clock mostly ticks once a second. So you start adding that up, you're up to 86,000 times a day, and you get to 31 million ticks a year from your grandfather clock. So it kind of makes sense that after a while it's going to need somebody like me to at least oil it, if not repair it. But people still come, and think that, the demons have landed from Jupiter and jinxed their clock, or, granddad is mad at them and he stopped the clock. These are machines that need to be serviced, and if they aren't, eventually they don't work anymore until somebody like me takes them apart and deals with the wear and the dirt that's in there. So you can see with watches and smaller clocks, they tick way more even, and they're going to need service. Some grandfather clocks get ridiculous, so I just like to show this this picture. Again, this is not me. This is not a family member. This was just an ad for a clock that came up at auction. My apologies if anybody owns this clock that's here, but I hope you didn't bring it in for me to appraise. But they do get a little crazy sometimes. So. Of course, in my horology and art collection, I look for images that have tall clocks, grandfather clocks, in them too. And this is a scene from early America. Again, this is a frolic which was kind of a chaperoned way for young people to meet and flirt and maybe decide to get married. But you knew it was an affluent home, a sophisticated home, because there's a tall clock in the corner. They were expensive. If you looked at old inventories, estate probate inventories, the clock was often the most valuable thing that a family owned. So if they had one, it was a signal right away for anybody looking at the painting that this was a family that had money. This is another example. This is by a well-known, better than folk art painter in New England called Robert Peckham. And you see a tall clock standing in the corner as well. So you think at first, oh, this is a, a nice family gathering. But if you're thinking about it, the people look a little sad and it's kind of dark in there even though it's summer. And that's because the little girl next to the infant in the mother's lap had died about 3 months before the painting was done. And there's a history, as you'll see, of posthumous painting where in these artworks, they often included people who had passed away to show that they were remembered and still a part of the family. So this is his whole Peckham family, essentially, with his dead daughter, Elizabeth, who's still shown within the family unit. Sometimes it gets even more specific because George Slacks, this shows that George Slacks not only died May 8th, 1829, but that's the exact time that he died, shown on the pocket watch. This is a little watercolor done by a Connecticut artist. So, and you see the little watch key in his press there too. So there was a great exhibit of this concept of posthumous portraiture at the American Folk Art Museum last year in New York City, where, again, showing how common this was and several interesting examples. This is a great painting. Again, that watch is not there by accident or because the kid liked to play with it. It's that symbol of mortality, and this kid was no longer in this world. So this was a memorial painting in a sense, but with that metaphorical, right in your face image of the passage of time. This is another one, although it's not clear that this is a posthumous painting. The mother is in black, which is sometimes an indication of this, but they're smiling, and so we can't be sure. But again, there's a watch being held there, and it's not because the kid just got this watch, for First Communion. This was a symbol of telling us things. This is an image of George Washington's death scene, and you see that that his doctor is holding a watch and timing his pulse, just about at the time that they killed him, essentially, by bleeding him too much. But he would be dead by now anyway, so I guess, it's, it was going to happen eventually, but this shows it. But not only that, as soon as he died, this was another tradition often, the doctor rushed over and stopped the bedroom clock at Mount Vernon at the time of his death. And this clock is still known. It's in a museum in Virginia, and it's never been changed from the time that George Washington passed away. So that was done in other places. There's Napoleon's clock that is stopped at the time that he died. So again, it was a tradition that's not unfamiliar to people in history. Perhaps the most famous clock design from Simon Willard was what's called the banjo clock. If you asked Simon Willard himself for a banjo clock, he would have no idea what you were talking about. It was about 100 years later when they started calling them banjo clocks, even though I'd say it has only the vaguest resemblance to a banjo, but somebody decided that that's what it should be called. For him, it was his improved timepiece or his patent timepiece, because he was trying to make a clock that was smaller, just as accurate, and much less costly than a grandfather clock. Mostly they weren't strikers, it was just a timepiece, but it was a great design, and it's one which is still made to this day 200 years later. He patented it, and of course immediately everybody copied it anyway, so the patent didn't do him much good, but that was his patent timepiece, at least, that was called that. And they had, pretty simple movements, sort of smaller, simpler versions of what was in grandfather clocks at the time. But again, it was sort of revolutionary because they were inexpensive, but still quite accurate. And the claim was that, he kind of dreamed this up out of thin air, this design. But this is a picture of a movement from an English clock 100 years earlier, which to me looks quite similar. It came out of what's called a tavern clock, or an active parliament clock. So these were, again, were popular 100 years before the banjo clock, and they were called active parliament clocks because the parliament was always trying to find ways to raise tax money, and they decided to tax clocks. So people who had clocks had to pay a certain amount every year, so a lot of people got rid of their clocks and used this as a great excuse to go down to the tavern, hoist a couple, and see what time it was. So these were, again, tavern clocks, and they're quite collectible now and interesting, but they had similar movements to banjo clocks. So this is a banjo clock movement expanded. Again, this isn't going to be a gearhead talk, but just so you can see sort of the simplicity of what was in there. But if you made it wrong, it wasn't the clock anymore. You know, that each gear had to have the right number of teeth, or the clock would, you know, gain 20 minutes an hour. So, you know, once you figured it out, you could make a lot of them. But it's both simple and complicated at the same time. What's fun is that often when I've serviced banjo clocks, I find records from the past of other guys that have been in there before me. So you can see in this case, this is just, again, on one of those movement plates of the banjo clock, that this guy scratched his name on there and noted when he had worked on it, partly for his own benefit. If it came back to him, he would know what he had done, but so that people in the future do that too. And I too, perhaps not, you know, scrawling over the whole clock, but in much smaller font, I inscribed my own initials and date when I worked on it, so I know. And again, if anybody 200 years from now cares that somebody worked on the clock, they'll find the evidence inside. Sometimes it was much bolder. You know, these clock makers certainly had stickers that they put inside clocks too, which you see a lot of. This is not 2002, this is 1902, when this clock maker or repair shop in Chelsea, Mass. Worked on this clock and put their sticker in there showing it. So here you see this is the throat glass from a banjo clock. So you see he's, you know, trying to announce to the world that these things were patented. So that's often what you see on the clock glass as an announcement of the patent. There's another clock. Why she's pointing at her head, I have no idea. Maybe somebody here has a theory on what she's pointing at. But it's an interesting clock glass, and again, it shows the patent. And this is églamisé, meaning it's painted on the back of the glass. It's reverse painting, it's called, because you don't want it painted on the front because the paint will deteriorate or be damaged. And you also get a very kind of luminous, reflective effect if the painting is on the back side of the clock glass. So there's another one. This is the lower box of the banjo clock, and this was quite a popular motif. It was from the War of 1812, and it's showing a naval victory by John Paul Jones. So again, it was a very popular motif. Sometimes you see chariots with goddesses, or you see the Boston State House. So there were a lot of motifs there, but again, that was a common one. So this is another of my horology and art thing. This is a folk art painting by Joseph Davis. So he was an itinerant folk art painter. He would go town to town and move in with you for a day or two if you wanted to have your portrait done. And they're quite distinctive. You pretty much know when you have a Joseph Davis painting. The odds are probably low that this family actually had a banjo clock. You could request, you know, certain things to be in your portrait to make you look more sophisticated and prosperous. Maybe they had a cat. But the cat has got a nice spot under there too. But you know, this was again an indication that banjo clocks were around at this time, and also that they were viewed as a sign that you were somebody important if you had one. This is Eli Terry, who's again an important person, probably in the scheme of things much more important even than the Willards, because he really pioneered mass production of clock movements in America. Water-powered, so you can see here's his water wheel from his mill. But even earlier, he accepted a contract to produce 4,000 clocks movements in 3 years. And I can show you, this is a Terry-style movement. You can even pass this around. Some of the wheels are missing now, but brass was very expensive. You had to get it from England, and the English weren't keen on us making anything and selling us the brass to make anything. But we had plenty of wood here, so we figured out how to make a clock movement that was essentially, you know, 99% made out of local woods. And he was able to develop a technique for mass producing interchangeable parts for clock movements, where before clocks were made one at a time, two at a time. A clockmaker would make 10 a year, 12 a year. Suddenly he's making 4,000 in 3 years, and really began the Industrial Revolution in America and interchangeable parts. There's a lot of people who say it was the armories, the musket industries, Eli Whitney, but it really, those muskets did not have interchangeable parts until a decade or two after Eli Terry's clocks were being, pumped out the door by the thousands with parts where you could take one out and put in one from another clock, and it worked. So I'm a little biased on the subject, but I'm sticking to my story that it was the clock and watchmakers who led us to be the world's industrial powerhouse, not the guys making muskets. So there's again, a picture of what's being passed around now too, showing the wheels. The plates are made out of oak. The wheels are cherry wood. You wanted a nice dense wood that wouldn't fracture in the wrong orientation. So that was good. And one of the first designs that these wood movements were used for after grandfather clocks was in the pillar and scroll clock. And it's pretty obvious why this is called a pillar and scroll clock, but they were among the first, again, mass-produced and much more affordable clocks, probably a third of the price of Simon Willard's banjo clocks. Regular, not even middle class, but farmer people could have clocks, and they were sold by itinerant peddlers who went around the countryside. Here's a peddler hawking his wares, and you can see he's got a clock back there in the back of the wagon. That I guess he was warming him up with the coffee grinder, and then was going to hit him with the clock a little bit later on. So that's how a lot of the marketing was done. They sent a lot of peddlers down south. They got a bad reputation, these Yankee peddlers that sold junk that was no good. So a lot of clocks in the South got over-pasted labels over the original label saying who made the clock. They put a label with a southern city and name on it, hoping to make people think that the clock was made down south instead. So a clock like this, Seth Thomas, big name in clockmaking. You see the wood movement up there, and you see his label down there. But again, that might have been over-pasted down in Savannah or Charleston to try to get folks not so worried. Let's see. Now I've blanked on this guy's name. It's coming though. Ron, who is this? Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. How could I forget? It's Seth Thomas. Sorry. Yeah. Seth, speak to me. Yeah. So, as often happens, the second guy with the idea makes even more money than the inventor. So Seth bought out, and a partner bought out Eli Terry and went on, to make tons more money than Eli Terry did. And his name even is on clocks now that are made in China. Some of them come here and they say Seth Thomas on them. The real Seth Thomas Company ended in 1958. They were based in Thomaston, Connecticut, and there was a big flood that year and sort of wiped out the factory. And that was the end of sort of the original Seth Thomas Company. But another invention, because if you look at that pillar and scroll clock, there's some very fragile aspects to that. And the other problem was that wood movement clocks were tough to ship by water, and they could be unreliable and somewhat fragile. So there was a huge economic recession in the 1830s, almost as bad as the Great Depression. Nobody had any money. All the clockmakers with making woodworks clocks were going out of business. And Chauncey Jerome claims in a dream he had an idea for making an inexpensive brass movement clock. We were starting to make our own brass here. We had brass. And if you see there's a large hole up there where the hands are, that's so you and your neighbors who were jealous could come and see, oh boy, he's got one of those brass clocks now. He's got a modern clock. So these were affordable. They saved the American clock business by making brass clocks, and they could be exported. So we sent a lot of them over to England, and England was having a problem with cheap imports. Does that sound familiar? But the way they dealt with cheap imports is they assumed, as they did with Eli Terry, he sent a boatload of clocks over. And, they looked at the paperwork, $1.50 each. Clearly, you're dumping these. Nobody can make clocks for $1.50 each. We're buying the whole boatload. So they bought them all thinking they'd put them out of business. It cost him $1 to make these clocks. Well, this is great. Sends another boatload over, another $1.50 each. Boom, we're buying them. Third boatload. They said, I guess he's not dumping. So if you go to England now, you see a lot of American-made Connecticut clocks that are still all over England. It wasn't great for the English clockmakers, but they were still making more expensive clocks by the old methods. They weren't willing to mechanize and create industrial processes for making clocks, and they paid the price. This, you know, and that story is familiar to us today. This is another prosperous clockmaker of the time too. Once we figured out how to make mainsprings so the clocks didn't have to run by weights hanging down, we could make much smaller shelf clocks that had springs inside instead of weights hanging down. This is a beehive clock, this style is called. And you can see that that was Elias Ingram we saw earlier, and this was his display advertisement of the types of clocks he made, and they often had pictures of their factories showing how, you know, these came out of a real prosperous enterprise, not somebody sitting by their fire, you know, banging these things out one at a time. And clocks were important parts of households. Usually they only had one. And even, you know, back in my grandmother's time, you know, there was the clock. They didn't have, you know, two in every room, and it wasn't on their microwave and on their refrigerator. They had a clock. And I love this picture because this is after the Great Fire in Salem, Massachusetts, and they're fleeing, you know, basically with what they could carry. And you can see that one of the few things that they carried out of the burning house was their prized mantle clock. I'm assuming that she only had 2 kids, because didn't leave the third one because she grabbed the clock. But I'm thinking that she had 2, and the clock was one of her cherished possessions that she brought with them. Again, clocks had not lost their appeal as something to show how smart you were, or rich, or sophisticated. And a lot of people wanted to have their picture taken with a clock. You probably recognize this guy. This is George Custer. He had many portraits taken of himself. He was proud of his appearance. He could have used some shampoo, I think, in this picture, but he's standing there with the clock that was a prop in Matthew Brady's photo studio. He was one of the most important photographers of the Civil War era and a bit after. And you could, if you were having your portrait done by Matthew Brady, you could have this clock in the picture with you. This is the clock. It was a known model. It was the Reaper model, it was called. And this is just one of the descriptions of that clock from 1878 that showed the name of the model and what it was. And you can see another gentleman who you may recognize also chose to have Matthew Brady take his picture. This is just after the Civil War. Robert E. Lee decided to have at least half of the clock in his portrait. So that's who we're seeing there. This is almost my favorite. This is Mary Walker, Dr. Mary Walker, the first woman to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. She was awarded it by Abraham Lincoln for her service for wounded soldiers in the Civil War. And here she is standing again with the Reaper clock. But she was not only a major advocate for women's suffrage, but also for women's dress reform. So anybody at the time looking at this picture would have realized that she was not dressed properly or appropriately for the time. But she early on was objecting to the corsets, to the unwieldy clothing that women were forced to wear at the time that limited their mobility and damaged their health. So she's actually wearing something that would have been quite controversial at the time, and she carried on for some decades afterward in the dress reform movement, and this is an example of what she was wearing at the time. So there's some of you probably are familiar with the book Longitude or have seen the film because timekeeping was crucial on the ocean to determine where you were. And if you didn't know where you were, you had this kind of thing happen to you. So latitude was pretty easy with a sextant to know where you were north-south, but where you were east-west was a problem. This is Admiral Cloudsley Shovel. In the early 1700s, he was in command of a British fleet returning from the Mediterranean. He was approaching the south end of the British Isles. He was near the Scilly Islands, S-C-I-L-L-Y, and he was, in charge of the navigation. And one of his lieutenants said that, I think we're off course here, and the Scilly Islands are quite close and menacing. That guy was immediately strung up from the yardarm, and soon afterwards, the fleet ended up on the rocks at the Scilly Islands. Several ships were sunk, destroyed. Admiral Shovel survived, crawled up on the beach, and was bludgeoned to death by a woman stealing his watch. So it's sort of a fitting end for Cloudesley Shovel, but it was a wake-up call, even stronger one for the British Navy, who said, you know, we can't keep losing ships and sailors in this way. So they announced the Longitude Prize, which was the equivalent of several $1 million today, that was to be awarded to find a way to find the longitude at sea. And there were other methods besides timekeeping, because nobody thought that you could develop a watch or a timekeeper that could work at sea that would be accurate within a few seconds a month. And that's what you needed in order to determine your longitude when you were on the ocean out of the sight of land. So there were other methods, trying to look at the moons of Jupiter and stuff, all very complicated, but ones that people worked long and hard at. But eventually, we got to timekeeping. So again, this is a book. It's an excellent read about John Harrison, who was the clockmaker who worked for decades to solve the problems and to eventually win the Longitude Prize. But it was a drawn-out process. So again, it's a good read because the story, you know, expands into those other methods too of how people were trying to find the longitude. So there's a portrait of John Harrison showing the one that actually won the prize after about 40 years of work. It looks like a big pocket watch, but it's actually revolutionary in some ways, which allowed that type of accuracy in timekeeping. It's called H4, not by him, but by later, because there were 3 earlier clocks which were much bigger, much more complicated as he tried to work his way through all the problems. Because obviously a pendulum's not going to work when the ship's going back and forth. If it goes from 100 degrees to 0 degrees in your ship, that affects the metal in the clock movement, it affects the oils at the time that got thick or thin. So there were a lot of problems to solve for accuracy on shipboard. And so there's a view of the movement of H4. Again, a beautiful thing too, but it actually could be accurate within those parameters and allow for determination. This is H1, so you can see, and this thing stands about 3 feet tall. So you know, he was working big at the beginning. You can see these at the Greenwich Observatory in London. You can see these machines actually working because they were discovered and restored. So he sort of solved some problems with there. He was still trying to deal with the pendulum, but trying to make ones that were sort of independent of the rolling of the ship or of gravity. And he got real close, and enough so that he continued to get money from the longitude board as he was working. But it finally was a whole different design, that large pocket watch, that won the prize. His machines were really too complicated, difficult to make, but they eventually morphed into marine chronometers, which were made by the thousands, even though they were expensive, which almost in a mass-produced way could then be accurate enough for ships to use. And beginning in the early 1800s, ships had these, and they could not end up on the rocks as frequently. This is an interesting one because it was made by a Boston maker. Mostly they were English and French manufacturer, but we did have a chronometer maker in Boston, William Bond. This is a view of one of the key elements inside, a fusee. If you see that graduated cone gear on the left side, that equalized the power of the mainspring. Because if you think about it, a mainspring that's wound tight will make the clock run faster than when it's starting to lose power as it unwinds. But if you use a system kind of like a derailleur gear on a 10-speed bike, it changes the power of the mainspring going to the other gears as the spring winds down. So that's an integral part of a chronometer to keep the power equal as it's unwinding. And this is a nice old stereo view image of the William Bond shop in Boston. I wish I could look through the window a little better there, but the shop was there, and you can see it says chronometers in a couple of places on there too, because that was one thing they did. And these things needed to be serviced a lot. And in a port city like Boston, you know, the ship captains would arrive and bring their chronometers to be inspected and serviced. So here's another chronometer, which doesn't look in such great shape, and I might have given you a hint already, that this was on a ship that didn't do too well. So this was one of the objects that has been salvaged from the wreck of the Titanic, but obviously the chronometer can't tell you that you're running into an iceberg, so it wasn't useful for that. So the other place where timekeeping was vital was in railroads, because not only so that your sister got to New Bedford on time, but so that trains didn't crash into each other. Because a lot of the earliest lines were single-track lines; they weren't tracks side by side. So if the clock was coming from the train was coming from New Bedford and the other one was coming from Boston, if one didn't get off to a siding or the other one went by, you had a lot of expensive scrap metal there on the track. So this is one of the earliest known photographs of a train wreck. It's an ambrotype of a time when somebody's watch wasn't working well and they didn't get off at the right time. So eventually there were standards that were promulgated, but here's an example. Here's the Fall River Railroad, and in this case, big deal. The clock, the train, left at 7 and 3, and the other one, so there wasn't that big of a chance of these trains running into each other. But pretty soon, it's starting to get busy out there. There's 1850, Boston and Worcester. These trains are pretty frequent. So if your junky watch is off by 3 minutes, even, there might be a lot of consequences to that that could happen. So certainly clocks in train stations got more accurate. This is an example of kind of a railroad clock, a Seth Thomas clock of a regulator that you might see in a train station so that people could regulate things. But the bigger problem was that every town had its own time. Every town had its own noon based on when the clock was directly overhead. And this is only like 130 years ago till that was fixed. So the train schedules were impossible, because you had to decide which place's time you were running on. And the trains now were running fast enough, and the time between even New York and Boston was minutes different. New York and Albany was way different. This is an example of when it's noon in New York, the difference in time it is in all these other places. So it was unmanageable, especially for the railroad companies. So one of the solutions was you'd have a clock with two dials. One has railroad time, one has local time. So you could buy that, but that wouldn't help you, sort of figure out what the heck time it was really, and which time the train was running on. So that wasn't a good solution. And there were even watches that had multiple dials too. So, but again, that didn't solve the fundamental problem. So eventually, 1883, both the government and the railroad companies created standard time. So it's only been that long that we had 4 time zones, and the time in Boston is, when it's noon in Boston, it's noon in New York, and it's noon in Pittsburgh, and it's not noon in Los Angeles. It's 3 hours different. And so, I mean, it's sort of a hard concept now, and we still have bizarre things on our own timekeeping that we sort of haven't fleshed out yet, because the international date line is confusing. If you're trying to call your kid that's in Tokyo, well, wait, is it tomorrow? Is it yesterday? Are they sleeping or eating? So there's at some point we're all going to figure that out too, so it's not confusing that way. But in the meantime, at least in 1883, in this country, we established time zones. Worldwide, it was not until after World War I where we actually had 24 standard time zones around the world. People wanted to stick to their noon, and there was a lot of fundamental religious objection. By God, no railroad company is going to tell me when it's noon. It's noon when the sun's overhead. That's where God put the sun. So it was controversial for far longer than we can imagine now. So, and even daylight savings time, this started after World War I to try to, help with when people could be more productive. But even that's confusing. There's places that don't accept daylight savings time. So, we end up in these conundrums still with timekeeping that, maybe we shouldn't laugh so much at all these places in America. There were more than 600 time zones in America before 1883. It was pretty complicated. So to sort this out, you needed a good watch too, and if you were on the railroad, you needed a very good watch. And one of the innovators and major first companies that mass-produced accurate clocks here was the Waltham Watch Company that's in Waltham, Mass, nearby. So here's an early view of the factory. And they really made their first money successfully for the Civil War. So here's a photograph, a daguerreotype of a Civil War soldier very proudly holding his soldier's watch. And that's really how the company first became prosperous. Before that, you had expensive kind of handmade watches from England, or you had junk from Switzerland. So that's, it sounds like, I don't know what I'm talking about now, because we all think of Swiss watches, Rolexes, and even way back, all these famous names. Swiss watches, pinnacle of superiority and accuracy. But the watches coming out of Switzerland at this time were horrible. 2 out of 3 didn't work. They were cheaply made. They were mass-produced under an old sort of cottage system. So the time was ripe. If somebody could mass-produce watches the same way they could mass-produce clocks, they could do the world a service and make a lot of money. And that's one thing that Waltham did. And eventually they made watches for railroad service. And this is an example of a railroad-grade Waltham 23-jewel Vanguard that has an up-down indicator indicating that the state of wind of a clock, when you wind it all the way up, it's up to 0, meaning it hasn't run down at all yet. And if you were the engineer or the conductor, you need to carry a railroad-grade watch and the certificate showing when it was cleaned recently and when it was inspected recently. And if it hadn't been either of those things, the inspector took your watch, gave you a loaner, and it was serviced, and it was expensive. So this was very serious. Again, they didn't want trains crashing, so this was a whole system of railroad inspection that carried on. There's some great early photographs of the Waltham Watch Factory. I have a number of them, but this shows some of the people at work, mass-producing watches, but you still needed, people who were putting them together, adjusting them, inspecting them. So there's another view of it. And about 40% of the workforce were women, and they received equal pay for equal jobs. That's a little misleading because the women often were in lower skill, lower paid jobs, but if they were doing the same job as a man, they were paid the same money. And again, it was almost half of the workforce were women. They also ran a school where they would train people to be watchmakers. That was something that should have been done recently too, because we were running out of watchmakers, and all those companies like Rolex that wanted to sell people a $10,000 watch couldn't necessarily tell them how it was going to be fixed later. So they've gotten more energetic now in recreating watch schools and getting more people to learn watchmaking, but that was a problem for a while. So here's another couple of examples of railroad-grade watches. You see Ball, Cleveland. Webb C. Ball was a watchmaker who was instrumental in creating the standards and the inspection regimens for railroad watches. And this is an example of one of those certificates or papers that you had to carry with your railroad watch, saying when it had been cleaned, when it was inspected, and you better make sure that this continues to happen, or they're going to take it away from you. So we're getting near the end. If folks are interested in this subject, there is the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. I have a few examples of their magazines up there, which you're welcome to take. There's still about 12,000 of us countrywide and internationally. I just went to their annual convention. About 1,500 people were there, so there's still a number of people interested in this. This is down in Columbia, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg in York, and they have a big, beautiful museum there that's worth going to. One of my things that I take a lot of time with, I'm chairman of the Time Symposium Committee for the NAWCC, and I organize their conferences every year. And this year, in September, just coming up pretty soon, it's going to be at the Henry Ford Museum, where I've recruited, again, a great group of speakers like I did for the Boston event, who are going to be talking about some of these themes of mass production and industrial innovation, because I'm claiming, and maybe others will agree with me, that without Eli Terry, without Waltham Watch Company, there never would have been the Model T, because there were not the machine tools, the mass production techniques that enabled Henry Ford to begin mass producing inexpensive, reliable cars. So there's Henry Ford himself. What most people don't know is that the first things he ever tinkered with when he was 12 were clocks and watches. He worked as a watch repairer or watchmaker for years when he was in his youth, and he continued a lifelong interest in clocks and watches. He had a full-time watchmaker that worked for the Ford Motor Company, and he would go spend a day with them tinkering with stuff. At one time, the Henry Ford Museum had more than 7,000 clocks and watches, many of them collected by Ford himself. So you see that he was, that there's a story there that most people don't tell. So as we're almost to the end, I'm going back to one of my horology and art paintings. This is a Jerome Thompson painting of a climbing party in the 1850s who have gone to the top of Mount Mansfield, the tallest mountain in Vermont. And you can't quite see it here, but you're going to see a close-up of the guy seated in the middle. He's holding his watch up saying, folks, it's getting late, and if we don't get down this mountain soon, we're going to be in trouble. So this is where I say that I'm also don't want to overstay my welcome here, but I'm happy to take some questions, and then we'll look at a few of the clocks on the table here, too. So thanks for coming. Thank you. All right, have I just buried you with information here? Yes, sir.
I see half of your clocks have Roman numerals and the other half have Arabic numerals. Can you make a comment on that?
A couple of things. One is that Roman numerals were not allowed on railroad watches because they didn't want anybody to mix it up. But I think, as you probably know, clocks still are sort of this symbol of stability, you know, in TV shows and movies. If there's a grandfather clock there, oh, you know, this is a stable, you know, happy family. And I think Roman numerals kind of speak to tradition and old-fashioned, you know, values that are strong. So I think, you know, Arabic numerals are kind of more modern, even though you know better what time it is in a way. A lot of people note that when they're on clocks, 4 is not IV, it's 4 slashes. And, you know, there's a lot of crazy theories about what that is, but the one that's most believable is that it just balances the look of the dial because, you know, you have a lot of slashes over there at 8, so to sort of make the dial look right, you have a lot of slashes over there at 4 also that, you know, make it the dial a little more attractive visually. So I think you don't see too many timepieces now with Roman numerals on them. Or any numbers at all sometimes, but yeah, that's right. But you know, I think it was a choice too. So you usually had an option with the clock or watch when you bought it of specifying or just selecting the dial you wanted that could have had either types of numbers on it. So it looks like and it's called the symbol. There are some calendars that were perpetual that knew the short and long months. So this just bumps around every time at midnight, and if it's a shorter month, you can just knock this this red hand around. I mean, I've had these at antique shows for sale, and people say, "What's going on with the 31-second clock here?" You know, they think this is the second hand going around. So, you know, I have some fun with that sometimes, but usually I just tell them it's a calendar clock. And you know, that added another, you know, $1.12 to the price of the $6 clock, you know, when this was new, if you got the calendar option. So you had, you know, a variety of options with these. You also had ones that struck the hours. If you ever see one winding hole, it means it's just a timepiece. It doesn't do any bonging. If there's two, it's going to be a striking clock, so you're going to hear the sound, the hour announced audibly. So if it's time, strike, and calendar, you've got 3 functions, and the calendar would be the other one too. So this is a time and calendar model. And since we're looking at it, this was made by the Sessions Clock Company, and I see we have another Sessions clock here too. This was the successor to the E.N. Welsh company that was one of the big 19th century manufacturers, but the Sessions family took it over in the early 20th century and made sort of average grade clocks for about 30 years after that, of many styles, like the other companies did too. So Sessions didn't make any great clocks, but they made millions of affordable, relatively reliable clocks too that were all over the country. This is a paper dial, and a lot of times these really deteriorate badly. You see it's starting to do that just because some of the oil fumes maybe came out and started to stain the paper. And there are replacement paper dials, and sometimes clocks have a replacement dial, which affects the value a little bit. But today, because of the slackening interest in antiques in general, clocks like this aren't worth very much. I go to auctions where, if this gets a $150 bid, you're lucky. I used to sell them for $500, so it's capitalism basically. It's supply and demand where if fewer people want them, the price goes down, and it's actually good because then people who don't want a $500 clock but would love this for $110, now they're going to buy it and they're going to own it and love it. So the system works.
This particular clock used to hang in this building,
Uh-huh.
and it's now on loan from the library, the Dartmouth Southwest Library.
Yeah.
It's on loan to us.
I see. Well, they should have loaned you a better one, though. Where's the good one? Yeah. Yes, sir.
On these tower bells, were they made of a particular metal or alloys to ring in certain ways?
Oh, yeah. It was bell founding was extremely complicated and a lot of times failed. Either, it cracked when they took it out. They dig big pits with sand and, pour the bronze in there usually. And then to get the right tone, you had to file them and shape them and all to get the right. So, bell founding is not easy.
Have you got a favorite bell sounding place?
Oh, well, I'm a sucker for Big Ben, You stand there and you get the chills. I don't know. Well, I do, I can't speak for everybody. But, no, that sound is special. And, and it went through, World War II and all. So it's an important sound, and I guess I like it. An interesting story that in Lawrence, there's a mill tower clock there that's second in size to Big Ben. It's only 6 inches. The dial's 6 inches smaller, and they restored it, but the bell had been taken away, stolen, whatever, like 50 years earlier, probably melted because that's a ton of bronze there that's worth money. So they were going to buy a new bell, and I wasn't involved in the restoration project at that time, but I was set up at an antique show, and a guy from England who happened to be over said, I'm a bell maker, and I bid on replacing the clock in Lawrence, and they said my bid was too high, and they went with a bell maker in Belgium. And he said, and I told them that no one's going to be able to hear that bell, and they didn't believe me. And now that Belgian bell is up there with 4 microphones around it and big speakers sticking out of the tower because, they just didn't spec out the bell in a way that was going to be loud enough. So, yeah.
On the dark side, when was the first time a clock was attached as a time bomb?
Yeah. I don't know the first time, but it's very close to the first time was with the first submarine. Because during the American Revolution, a Yale student, in fact, invented one of the first submarines, this thing that you would turn a crank with a screw propeller, and he was going to go underwater up to the British flagship that was off Long Island and attach a bomb to the bottom of the ship with a clockwork mechanism so that he could then back away and it would blow the ship up. So he gets there and he's starting to drill and he's starting to drill and he's starting to drill and he realizes he's trying to drill through the copper sheathing that was put on the bottom of warships so that the worm wouldn't eat up the wooden ship. And he couldn't get through it. So it's starting to get dawn, it's light. It took him a long time to get there. So he started, backing away full blast, and the guys on the ship saw him and were shooting at him. So he finally kind of jettisoned the torpedo, and it, blew sky high in the water. But it scared the British that something bad could happen. But I don't know of a bomb before that had a clockwork mechanism in it. But feel free to dig that out for me and tell me if you find an earlier one. Yes, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Well, my grandmother had a clock that had a single hand, and it had a glass globe, and it rotated.
Uh-huh.
And you take the globe off and wind it up, and you set it down, and it would, rotate around.
Yes.
So I was interested when you mentioned one.
Yes, those are called anniversary clocks. because theoretically they run a year or even 400 days, because they're also called 400-day clocks. So you only have to wind them once a year, because that's basically a pendulum. But instead of going back and forth 100 times a minute, it only oscillates 8 times a minute, so it takes it a year to run down the spring at the same rate. So I've repaired a number. I have one on my bench now, and probably several million of those have come from Germany, and people bring them to me, and they would like to have them repaired, and when I tell them they aren't valuable, most of them say repair it anyway, but they're interesting quality and they were a good concept, but they're lousy timekeepers, but they're fun to watch. The problem is, too, that some people think those balls are supposed to spin and not just oscillate. They just go back hardly at all. So, Uncle Ernie comes along and says, oh, you're supposed to really torque this thing around. So they, wind it up on that spring thing and, totally destroy the little wire that it hangs from. So when I see that, all corkscrewed, it looks like Uncle Ernie got to this one first. Yeah. Did you have a question, Bob?
I had a comment,
Mhm.
talking about bells, and I once had a student who worked with the Zildjian Cymbal Company, and I was told, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, that the word Zildjian means bell maker in the language that it's in. And
Yeah.
he said that the company was one of the oldest continuously operating corporations existing in the world, starting like 1500.
Yeah.
They make cymbals, which are
Yeah.
bells.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And,
Yeah, I've heard of that cymbal
finger
company.
cymbals,
Yeah, but I didn't know the rest of that story. So.